Okay, this work, let me describe it first. It's acrylic on canvas, pre-stretched, and there are some collage pieces that's glued on, and then everything is set on a wooden back because even though this is done in the form of a traditional Asian scroll, since I found out it was to be hung on the wall, it needed a backing. So typically, traditionally, the wood backing is not there. So it's just a scroll that you can roll in and roll out. And also because this was for a typically American audience, instead of going from right to left as traditionally done, I've made the decision to do it from left to right, just so that it doesn't, the direction of viewing is not so confusing to the American audience or people who are not used to looking at scrolls. And the traditional scroll is usually to be looked at only about 10 to 12 inches at a time, and that was to engage the audience in the participation in the timeline of the storytelling. So I chose that way to tell the story, and that is part of our U.S. history, the story of racial prejudice against Asians from early on, from the Chinese railroad workers all the way up to the COVID era. And the rolled up ends allowed me to, to impart the question whether or not the story continues or could it end. So that's why I chose this format. Some of these events are very known. I mean, they're just known to most of us, like the Japanese internment camps, the railroad workers. But many of these other stories, or Vincent Chin, which is pretty recent, but as I looked into the history of racial prejudice against Asians, I found out that it wasn't just Chinese or the Japanese, it was Filipinos, it was Indian Americans or Pakistani Americans during 9/11, or just people with shades of brown skin tones are mistaken for, Asians. So the research I did was just a lot of it was expanded from the knowledge I already knew of some of these events, and I did most of the looking online, and a lot of it came from like museums and research centers that that focus on anti-discriminatory purposes. So that's how I got a lot of these details, and from there I mostly chose stories that I thought represented a cross-section of people, and also a mixture of group discrimination versus individual victims, just to kind of lay out the array of events and different kinds of acts. Typically, I do aqua media, acrylics and watercolor and casing. Traditional scrolls are done on rice paper with like ink, but again, that was hard the material was hard for me to come by, and I didn't want to just, I wanted to create something that's modern, but in the mode of a traditional way. So the acrylic was just something that I work with all the time, and also I have these huge rolls of canvas that I could decide how long a history I wanted to do, and roll it back. So that was the decision basis.
How long did you spend on coming together with this idea and
I
the piece?
actually spent a long time on doing the research, and then a long time painting, designing and painting it, because it was emotionally very hard for me personally after reading, researching a lot of what happened. So I had taken a lot of breaks in between just to kind of, you know, calm myself before picking up the brush again and paint. And I knew I had a deadline, so I kind of had to push myself on that. And I typically do abstracts, and my work usually has a lot to do with looking at time as not a singular direction, but a multifaceted thing, because I'm interested in not just history that was past, but also dreams of future and the possibilities of what future may be. So I usually explore the how the past affect us in the present, and how what we think about the past may suggest what our future might be like. So in that sense, the decision to do this as a timeline story kind of, it melted with what I usually do, except I turned it upside down and depicted the story as a singular timeline instead of abstracted, multifaceted time and space. Forgive but not forget, and since a lot of my work are abstract paintings, names are usually the last thing I do. Even when I start out an artwork with an idea, and maybe with a title already, they usually change once the work is done, because the painting or the work takes on a personality, and it grows as I work on it. This one, I guess my intent was very clear, but the title, I wanted it to be not too long, but something that easily anybody can identify with it. And since I'm depicting a history of really violence, it was, I didn't want the viewers to take away a sense of hate, or holding on to hate, or I wanted them to kind of remember what's happened before, but at the same time being able to move forward into the future. So forgive but not forget. I think we should not forget history because we don't want to repeat it. But at the same time, we need to forgive people, and because that's the only way we could surpass what happened in the past. It is very unique and very different. So this is an outlier. And I'm very glad I did it. I occasionally pick up a brush and I might do something that's very traditional and based on all the fundamentals of art, like the focal points and movements and light and dark and all that stuff, just to, just to become familiar again with all that stuff. So I do traditional paintings, but it's usually just for myself, as a practice, just to stay in shape. So this is pretty much an outlier. It was mostly so call a lot of my artwork as designing rather than just painting, because a lot of my work is very cerebral. I think about it and not just paint out of how I feel, more thinking and less feeling. And this one was, the designing of it was kind of hard because I was getting into the subject matter in detail, and that was, a lot of it was new to me. So picking and choosing which story to tell and how to lay them out, all the individual stories, but at the same time having them all connect into one single work that flows along the canvas as a single timeline. That was, I guess that was pretty challenging. So that is where when I said I design my work, comes in. And I'm actually, as an artist, trying to move more away from that. But as an architect, you always, first of all, you have a client, so the client lays out the parameters of what they want. So there's a program. With art, typically there's not a program. It's just like, here's a opportunity and do what you want. And so you have to create what in architecture we call a partie, which is the theme on which to build your work on. And so that's what I did here. I thought about for a long time how I want to approach this project. And once I decided to do a timeline and a history, that was my partie. And then I started building on that. So that's very an architect's approach to a project, to a challenge. And I want to add that the rest of the exhibit is wonderful. This is first time I've seen it, and I'm just amazed at the creativity and the diversity in the work that have been presented here. I'm just amazed.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.